Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the privilege of being here a second time to speak with you. Thank you for your gifts, with which gives me power to say what I need to say. It seems to me that it's very appropriate that this meeting is taking place at this time. This is the time when the sun keeps getting shorter and shorter. The days are shorter. The sun keeps moving into the south. And you can wonder, what happens if that sun doesn't shine again, if it loses its strength? You know? And if it is happening, what can we as human beings do about it? Very, very little, but we can do what we can. In the Mohawk Nation, our New Year's is not until certain stars are directly overhead, which usually takes place at sunset, when they're overhead at sunset. This usually takes place a little after the middle of January. And there's a little warm spell that people could come and travel from their hunting lodges down to the place where they had their cornfields in the summertime. And at that time, the job of the people is to go around to each of the other houses and make amends for any problems, for anything, any disagreements that have taken up over the years, to renew that relationship. And then the clans go meet with other clans. Are there any problems we've had over the year that we kind of need to resolve? And they do resolve them. And then at the end of the 9th day, the people come to the ceremony, but before they come to the ceremony, they put out their fire. All of the fire, all of the embers, all of the little sparks even, are extinguished in every household in the entire community in January. And the people come to the meeting, come to the longhouse and meet there together. And at that time, a new fire is kindled. It's done with a bow and flint. And you keep going, you keep going, you keep going until there is enough heat that has been generated that where that arrow is into herbs and earth, that it bursts into flame. And with that flame, the people make a new fire. And at the end of the ceremony, and each of the people return to their homes, they take a piece of that fire with them. They take an ember that's been packaged in a certain way, and they carry it home. And there they rekindle their cold stoves and get a fire going again. And throughout the year that follows, it means that every home in the community is living from the same fire. To me, this happens every year, and it's always so beautiful and so empowering that this kind of thing happens. And it seems like this meeting that we're having here today is kind of preparation for that ceremony. Preparation for a time when you rekindle your own fires from one fire and take it home to your various communities, to your families, but as a united people, much empowered more than exists at the present time. I have a number of things I would like to do today. It's kind of a mixture of stuff because I remembered things I should have spoken about yesterday and I failed to do so. So I want to talk about the rules of treaty interpretation. And if you ever have a court case, this is the way that the courts are supposed to interpret the jurisprudence. One of them comes from the Badger case. And it says that the key interpretive principles which apply to treaties are first, that any ambiguity in the treaty will be resolved in favor of the Indians. And second, that treaties should be interpreted in a manner that maintains the integrity of the Crown, particularly the Crown's fiduciary obligation towards Aboriginal people. What does that mean? Well, you go to court with one idea, what we talked about yesterday, about the treaty and how the treaty is supposed to be interpreted. And the government of Canada sends its lawyers in. And they say, oh no, it's not that way. This is the way it is. The Crown is supreme and this and this and this and that. Well, the court has to decide. And how does it decide? It goes to the rules of treaty interpretation. That's how it has to decide and how it will decide. A second principle is that it must be remembered that a treaty represents an exchange of solemn promises between the Crown and the various Indian nations. It is an agreement whose nature is sacred. That's from the Seawee decision. George Seawee from the Huron Nation took that case. And he won that case in the Supreme Court of Canada. Another one. The honor of the Crown is always at stake in dealing with Indian people. Everything that the government of Canada, the Queen's government, does with regard to Indian people involves the honor of the Crown. The interpretation of treaties and statutory provisions which have an impact upon treaty or Aboriginal rights must be approached in a manner which maintains the integrity of the Crown. If any government official is doing something that makes the Crown look pretty rough, pretty raw, pretty dirty, the court will overrule it because this is the obligation of the Supreme Court of Canada. That was also Sparrow. Sparrow is a very good case, 1990. It was the first case that was argued before the Supreme Court after the 1982 Constitution. It's got its problems, but it's a good ruling. Any ambiguities, you could mean this, it could mean that. Any ambiguities, any doubtful expressions in the wording of the treaty or the document must be resolved in favor of the Indians. If we have a choice, in favor of the Indians. A corollary to this principle that any limitations which restrict the rights of Indians under treaty must be narrowly construed. In other words, we must give it the tightest possible meaning to it, rather than, it goes this way and that way. No, it has to be very, very narrow. In making and applying treaties, the Crown must act with honor and integrity, avoiding even the appearance of sharp dealing. Even the appearance of, we're putting something over on the Indians. It can't look that way. It has to be very clear. An honorable interpretation of an obligation cannot be a legalistic one that divorces the words from their purpose. You can't just look at it like from a law book. It has to be interpreted in the real meaning of what it intends to say. And thus the honor of the Crown demands that constitutional obligation to Aboriginal treaties be given a broad, purposive interpretation. In making and applying treaties, the Crown must act with honor and integrity, avoiding even the appearance of sharp dealing. I've repeated that. So we go into this thing here. I'm not sure if I can reduce the slide here. It's bigger than it should be. But what we have is a mythology of white dominance in Canada. We have to call it what it is. I'm not...
You want me to fix it?
I want to reduce that a little bit. We have to call it what it is, and it's a white dominance, and it's based upon white racism. And I'm going to approve or approve of what I'm telling you, because unless you deal with that up front, you're going to have a difficulty. There is something about this, that these myths simply hide qualities and oppression, but they contribute to a mythology of Canadian identity, the way Canadians think about themselves. I am a Canadian. What does that mean? Well, it has a certain feel to it, a flavor to it. But what that flavor is something that is called the Nero complex, and an African political scientist named Albert Mimi says this. The reality of being a colonizer means agreeing to a non-legitimately privileged person as a usurper, or taking over of someone else's rights. All at the very moment of triumph. Look at Canada. Look at the country we have created here. The settler realizes, I did this on stolen lands. I did this by oppressing the real owners of the land. Look at Canada. You see, it hits people very hard. There's a what I call a perpetrator trauma that goes exactly with the trauma that you all suffer from as a result of having been dealt with in this manner. Therefore, how does Canada handle it? It falsifies its history. It rewrites its laws, and it puts the Indian as something in the past. It extinguishes memories. People don't want to talk about the past. They want to talk about, hey, let's reconcile. Reconciliation is here. And this also happens. See if I can move up this slide here. I guess I can't. What there is underneath here is supposed to be codename Geronimo. And underneath it is the face of Osama bin Laden. You see, here's the fiercest enemy of the whole world practically that is in the minds of people is Osama bin Laden. And what's his code name in the military? Geronimo. Oh. there's another part of the slide that isn't showing here, and that is that in Vietnam, when the soldiers had to go out and face the enemy and fight, that was referred to as going into Indian country. See, there's this kind of a thing that's stuck in the minds of the settlers that they just can't get rid of. And so this serves to justify violence against Aboriginal people. Just as we are instructed to celebrate Canada's diversity, we bring in these people from all over the world, we are also taught to forge an erasure of the colonial tactics of rule and the ways in which the whiteness instructs the teaching of history. What your kids learn in school with the Manitoba curriculum is a history of white settlement in Canada. We have to call it what it is. There are national narratives that construct Canada, and it advertises itself all over the world as a moral, a very benevolent place. Canada's the good guys in the world. They're very polite people. They're very generous. They're very, a lot of ethics and equal subject. And this is the national dream of innocence. The Canadian establishment becomes very upset with anyone who disturbs the dream. Just say, oh, just a minute, I want to talk about what happened to the Indians. No, sit down, out of here. See, that's the way it works. The settler defines progress as a very positive attribution and takes credit for having achieved it. Look what we've done to this country. We've tamed the wilderness. We've brought things under control. What they don't say is, but you can't drink the water anymore. You can't breathe the air anymore. That we're facing the possibility of extinction of the planet before the end of this century. They don't want to talk about that. The settler are encouraged to paint themselves as innocent bystanders. You know, you talk to someone about my parents went to residential school, this happened, my brothers and sisters are in prison and so on. I don't want to talk about that. No, we don't talk about that. That is not a part of the dialogue. Why? Because I'm not responsible for what happened in the past to your grandparents. I'm not responsible. I'm here today. I never did any of those things. So they deny that responsibility. But if they're not going to fix the problem today, who's going to do it? They are the ones who have achieved the benefits of colonialism. And they have not shared those benefits with the people that provided it, namely yourselves. Today there is much talk about reconciliation and fulfilling the promise of Section 35 of the Constitution, the nation-to-nation relationship, the recognition of rights, sincere, I believe, sincere intentions, billions of dollars. But there's a ghost. The ghost keeps appearing all the time in order to justify this. There's an invisible obstacle of which emerges a shining thing from the past, legitimized by racism, a sense of superiority that should have been put to rest a long time ago. You know, this sense of superiority comes right from the first Indian Act. The first Indian Act was called an Act for the Gradual Civilization of the Indians. That was the name of the Indian Act. And why was it called that? Because as uncivilized people, you were not capable of managing your own affairs. And therefore, we need an Indian Act to treat you as wards of the government, to make decisions for you. You do this, you do that. You stay here. You got to get a pass before you leave the reserve. See, that's the way it was done. That this thing is legitimized purely by racism. And so this ghost, as I call it here, keeps coming into the plans and keeps disturbing the future because it keeps coming up, it keeps coming around. And so this will continue to happen as long as we also feed that. As long as unconsciously we kind of agree, maybe, that we're not quite as good. And we can't figure out how it happened. And so what do? We get angry at ourselves. We get angry at the people closest to us. We get angry at our family. We get angry at our wives or our husbands. We get angry at our kids. Our kids get angry at their parents. Everyone gets angry, and they take it out on each other. Because it's very hard to figure out, how was I born into this poverty? What happened? It is very hard for people to understand. And they can say, it must be my fault. I must have done something wrong. And people began to act in self-destructive ways. They drive cars very late at night as fast as they can. There are accidents. There are people who put needles in their veins. There are people who take pills, who do everything to destroy themselves and get this out of me, whatever it is, because I'm not a good person. So this ghost, as I'm calling it, came here on the first boat of settlers. It landed in British Columbia with that first boatload. And it builds an illusion. And that first illusion was that planting the flag, planting the cross, the crown obtained complete ownership and jurisdiction over everything. Everything. Then the ghost began to spread lies about the local people. They're so dumb they can't even speak English. They're not really humans. They're creatures of the woods. Yesterday, remember that I mentioned about bands of Indians, like herds of elk. It goes further than that. What do you call an Indian male? He's a buck, right? You know, what are little kids? They're not children, they're papooses. You know, there's all this whole vocabulary of dehumanization and teaching people that they're a part of nature living in the forest with other animals. They're even too primitive that they're unable to own land. And so we have to do it over, and the ghost is a boaster that I represent a superior race of people. And because of our superiority, God gave us a duty to help you. We will bring great benefits to you less unfortunates. Benefits such as civilization. You will become civilized if you do what I tell you. You will become Christians. And I will look over you, and I will protect you. And I'm even going to let you hunt and fish until you become civilized and no longer do that. And so to the settlers, the ghost whispers, watch out for those people. They're warlike. They're savages. They're devil worshippers. The ghost has friends in high places. He teaches them. He inspires them in the art of denigrating Indian people. You start by controlling the land. You take it all of it. You leave them with nothing. The Indians really have no right to the lands. Lands are of no value to them. If they had land, it would be to the prejudice of the interests of the colonies. Joseph Trutch, Lieutenant Governor of British Columbia. 1867, the ghost is happy because that denial policy is still the law in British Columbia and still the law in Canada. See, that was one of the differences between the so-called Métis or the half-breed group, because they could own land, but Indians could not own land. The ghost is an outlaw. The ghost does not want the law to decide because the ghost knows that his policy is illegal. The courts have already ruled it is illegal. If you read the Royal Proclamation and what it says and look at your own land holdings now, you realize that it is illegal. Now, common law requires that the Crown recognize native title, that it must have these honorable dealings that we just talked about. So what do you look at in the British North American Act of 1982, in the Constitution today? The provinces hold the lands, but subject to any trust existing in respect thereto and to any interest of the province in the same. Now, the ghost pretends not to hear any truths that come along. And in 1888, the Queen's Privy Council, which was then like the Supreme Court of Canada, told Canada the province's beneficial interest in Indian lands is available to them whenever the estate of the Crown is disencumbered of the Indian title. And that's what the treaty process was all about. If you read the documents, you read the letters going back and forth between Ottawa and Winnipeg, Ottawa, Regina, Ottawa, and Edmonton, what are they talking about? Extinguishing the Indian title. We've got to go out there and we've got to do a treaty to extinguish the Indian title. Now, if they want to extinguish the Indian title, that's also an admission that you've got Indian title, whatever that is. You must have it, otherwise why would we have to extinguish it? So there is an admission there in the treaty, the very virtue of the treaty, that at that time, when you start the treaty, that you hold the title to those lands. The ghost survives by keeping the big question from being decided by the courts. All the stuff we were talking about yesterday has never been before the courts. You know, the courts can't say one way or the other because they haven't dealt with it. The Section 52 that I think is just dynamite has never been argued in a court in Canada since 1982. And so Canada has avoided any change in the way things have been for the last 150 years. Now, in 1909, Canada decided to take British Columbia to court on this very issue. And after several years of commissions that were establishing in dilly-dally, Canada decided that it was not in the national interest to have the question decided. And it passed a law making it illegal for Indians to retain a lawyer for a land claim. It was illegal for the Indian, and it was illegal for the lawyer. If the lawyer accepted money from an Indian for a land claim, the lawyer goes in the jail with the Indian. This law was on its books in Canada until 1952. I mean, within my lifetime, this law was in the books. I was in university, and the law was still in the books. So we jump to the Calder case. The Calder case was in 1973, and it was the first little bit of light that began to get shed on this. The government in the Calder case out in British Columbia argued that there was no Indian title. It never had existed, so how could it be there now? When the colonists arrived, British Columbia argued, the land was vacant. There was nobody here. There were just these uncivilized primitive creatures and no written language. They didn't have any symphonies. They didn't know what Beethoven was. They were incapable of owning land. And so the crown's sovereignty was asserted, and that was that. The Supreme Court ruled that Aboriginal title did exist. We got a ruling for the first time, but it split on the rest. 3 judges went one way, 3 judges went the other way. It never was decided. The ghost had been injured, but the ghost continued. And the ghost refuses today to give up. He has friends in high places. They enjoy fashioning the Crown's litigation strategies. They just pretend Aboriginal title has been ceded, released, and surrendered. And even after Chilcotin, the case that came up in 2014, the ghost remains defiant. The ghost knows how to use delay. How do we stop the ghost? We stop feeding it. We stop believing that the Canada is right. We stop saying that those are Crown lands. Those are your lands. Why do you call them Crown lands? We've got to have the political will and the courage to make change. We have to insist that the governments banish the ghosts. No ghosts are permitted at the rights and recognition table. No ghosts are permitted in negotiations. No ghosts are allowed in the courts. You've got to say that, and you've got to get rid of the ghosts. The person that has been the most active in dealing successfully with ghosts is a lawyer in British Columbia named Louise Mandel. She has been in court case after court case after court case and has been trying to expose the ghost. This is Louise Mandel, Canada's greatest ghost catcher. She has chased him through the Supreme Court of Canada in the Jack and Charlie case, the Sparrow case, Bear Island case, Lewis, Pamajuan, Vanderpeet, Opachazet, Delgamook, Osius, Okanagan, Haida Nation, the Morris case, and then Chilcotin Nation. Now, this idea is this myth that is carried by settlers has to do. Have you ever read the book or seen it on TV, The Little House on the Prairie? I'm sure you have, and you children watch it and they're enchanted by it. About these poor settlers who come out there and endure all kinds of dangers and wild animals and all kinds of things, and they establish their home. the very home their children are going to be raised in. But even in this idea of this, anything that goes wrong is blamed on the Indians. The purpose of this discussion that I'm having right now is to not turn you to be against the settlers, nor to turn the settlers against their own heritage, but it has to do to engage in the task of decolonizing our minds. It is not only your lands and your governments and the way of the Indian Act that you have to deal with. You have to deal with your own mind. And you'll be surprised as to how deeply colonized it is. I know my own mind, and I know the colonization that I have had to dig out of that and put it in the trash can. Here's some more of the imaging. The pioneer. The pioneer is the hero of Canada. Tamed the wilderness, goes out, puts civilization, builds cities, has farms, all of that. They are the pioneers. All of the images are very positive. And so the settlers have a thing that is called freeholders, meaning that for a long time you had to own land in order to vote. If you didn't own land, you couldn't vote. Still today, a senator has to own land in order to be a senator from a particular area of Canada. So, if the land is owned by the Indians, how can the settler settle it? Well, we have to pretend the Indians don't own it. That's what we have to do. And so the sovereignty and occupancy of the land of the Indian is disavowed, and the settler assumes the right to occupy it. The little house on the prairie is going to defend itself against its right to be there, and is going to try to drive off any Indians who try to take it away from him. The settler has in the mind of the settler that if the Indians ever have self-government and take control, they're going to treat the settlers like the settlers treated the Indians. This must be prevented at all costs. But at the same time that we have to do this, we have to disavow there's been no violence. The settlement of Canada has been peaceful settlement. So how do we deal with this? Because this mythology has to do with, well, the Indians are disappearing. They're a disappearing race. And in some ways, with smallpox and everything and poverty, that was true. In the year 1900, there were less than 100,000 Indians in Canada, from ocean to ocean. 100,000. Yesterday, the Grand Chief said there's going to be 100,000 Indians in Treaty 5 territory today. Well, there weren't that many in all of Canada in the year 1900. So that's all right. It's a dying race. They either adjust or they have to go. And then we have this empty, vacant land, and we get it all peacefully. But now we have a problem as a settler in getting land peacefully because we have our heroes. The guys who defeated the Indians. And so if it's peaceful, then how come we've got these guys who do, it's like a schizophrenia that they have. This is in the House of Commons, the door that I leave when I go to a committee. There is a picture of Dollard. He is the guy who single-handedly challenged the Iroquois. And annually, there are on this day in Quebec, it's like a national holiday. And there are these reenactments where people dress up like Indians and other people fight them and they defeat the Indians. This is done annually in Quebec. And he even has a postage stamp that was made in his honor. And this is the reenactment of where they put up a teepee. And then the settlers come in and they attack the teepee. And they have a monument put up to him. All of why? Because he got engaged in a battle with the Indians. But I thought it was peaceful. Okay, how are we going to deal with this? Well, first of all, this is the image of the Indian that is engraved in the mind of the settlers. It's put there when people are children. And they play games called Cowboys and Indians. And even the Indians want to be cowboys when they play that game. This is the image. So the settler is the hero who defended his people and his homeland, and after doing so, he recruits the vanquished Indian, the Indian he conquered. He used them to celebrate the victories of conquest. And so these historical relationships are within the national tradition in order to develop a mythology of white settler innocence. And it's in various forms today. This is the Calgary Stampede. Who leads the Calgary Stampede? The Indians. They get out there with all their headdresses and on their horses, and they lead the Calgary parade of all the white people behind who are following them in. They have, over in the bottom corner there, is the mini something butter. That's the trademark of the butter, this woman dressed up with all her Indian clothing. We have up above there, we have in the other corner, we have the kids playing cowboy and Indian. They're all dressed up and they put on their cowboy hats and the Indian does it, la 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 la, and they play, big deal. We have, in the other corner, we have the Lone Ranger. When I was, 6 years old or so, I always listened to the Lone Ranger on TV, on radio. We didn't have TV then. And he was accompanied by his faithful Indian guide, whose name was Tonto. Right? You know what Tonto means in Spanish? It means dumb, stupid. That's what the word Tonto means, is stupid. And so there we have the Lone Ranger. Oh, Silver. But the other thing, and I don't know, I can hardly even tell you about this because it makes me want to cry. And that is, when we were little kids, we played a game. Today, I call it the genocide game. At the time, the game was called 10 Little Indians. And there it is, all written right out. And it's done this way. A group of kids get around and they're sitting on the ground, and then they stand up one by one as they're 1 little, 2 little, 3 little Indian, 4 little, 5 little, 6 little Indian, 7 little, 8 little, 9 little Indians, 10 little Indian boys. That's half the song. The other half of the song is 10 little, 9 little, 8 little Indians, 7 little, 6 little, 5 little Indians, 4 little, 3 little, 2 little Indians, no little Indian boys. I mean, that hurts. It hurts me to know I played that game. So let's go on to the dream of the patriot and the idea in Canada that Canada is going to be, as it says here in the circle, it is the destiny of Canada that these British people will be united in one nationality from one ocean to the other. In other words, Canada was intended from the beginning to be a white British nation. That was its origin. Confederation had this idea, we're going to be from ocean to ocean. And it's said right there in the House of Commons, these are quotes from the House of Commons. He looked forward to the time when the whole expanse from the Atlantic to the Pacific would be peopled with a race the same as ourselves, enjoying the same political rights and moving forward to the same destiny. That's what the vision was. Or we can take this other one, that we have recognized their rights of the Aboriginals of the country. We've made treaties with them. We've given them compensation, which is not true, for their lands, dealing with them in a measure as with minors incapable of the management of their own affairs, but always acting generously towards them. These are the words that come out of John A. Macdonald, convincing what a great prime minister he's been because of his good treatment for the Indians. The company, meaning the Hudson Bay Company, had never pretended to extinguish these Aboriginal rights which had preceded theirs. A settlement must come to with the Indians for the sake of the protection of the colonists. And at the end, we had acted justly towards them, and we continue to do so. And there is Canada's emblem. And what does it say in the bottom on that blue ribbon? Amar Esquimar, from sea to sea. That's the emblem of Canada today. And what it means is, it has to do with one nation of white people of British descent from ocean to ocean, from sea to sea. See how these little messages are hidden away? The messages of colonialism are confronting us all the time, and we never really think of what they mean. And so even today, the Indian is romanticized as a figure of the past. There's no place for the Indian in settler society. We're going to have reconciliation of some kind, but we still have settlers and Indians. And there's a quote there from a French, an Algerian psychiatrist who wrote a book called Black Faces and White Mask. It has to do with the phenomena of the African who becomes colonized and wears a white mask. For the settlers, for the moment when colonizing disappears, if reconciliation should be that a group of white people are going to have to move out of an area into another area in order to have this as a country for the Indians, the settler has no wish to stay there. He'll move out because it's negative to the vision of a white country. And we see that in the residential school. This little kid is named Thomas Moore. And he went to residential school. And they were very proud to take his photo when he went into residential school, and equally as proud to show the photo of the product of the residential school. The hair's gone, the dress is gone, the manner is gone, the way he stands is gone, everything is gone. There's nothing in the young man to the right who's Indian at all. It's been erased by this process. And so we have this mythology that takes place. The Europeans are entitled to the land, and that has been codified into law. There's the slide that I was looking for. Geronimo. Now, I'm not sure if I can read all of this, but George Manuel, who was a very good friend of mine, spoke of the time when we come to a fork in the road, and we can continue to follow the fork, which leads us to everything is familiar. It's the way things are now. There's no trouble. We know how things work. Or there's a new road, and we're not sure where it's going to lead. It's a decolonized road. It's something that's different. Maybe a welfare check isn't going to come from chief and council anymore, or something, it's going to change, and people are unsure about it. And so people are having, at this time, to make a choice if they want to go to something different or as things are now. And so we have this situation that faces us today. Now, yesterday I talked about a bit about sovereignty, and I'd like to talk a little more about the term sovereignty. I do not believe in indigenous sovereignty. The reason I do not is because sovereignty means to rule over. S-O-V-E, rule, reign, to reign over. That's what sovereignty means. And so at the time of treaty, we have not just two different people coming together, but two different cultures coming together. We have the British, the commissioner, who wants to extinguish Indian title, and I am now in charge of the Indians. Sovereignty. I am sovereign over the Indians. But over here, we have the way it was done on Great Turtle Island, where we are all related to each other. And we're related not only to other human beings, but we're related to the animals, to our brother, the deer and the elk. Even little insects, we have to be careful of them because they feed the birds. And the birds give us their song. They're related to us. We're a part of this whole thing. And there was never any inclination, even in the way people raise their children, to destroy the sovereignty of the child. Enjoy the independence of the child, not sovereignty. So a child was allowed to discover the world, to go places, preventing any danger, nothing like that. There was protection. But at the same time, no one told a child, do this, eat your turnips, put on your hat, don't walk like this, don't talk to me like that. That's not indigenous culture. Children are treated with respect from the very time they are born. The European culture says, when the child cries, don't give him milk or anything because it'll just make him cry all the time to get more milk. But no, just a little whimper from an indigenous child, and the parents are right there. The brothers and sisters are there. Do you need anything? Anything you want? How can I make you more comfortable? You know, this is the difference of relationship of one group who comes in determined to get the rule over the other, and the other who says, how are you related to me? Oh, the queen. Well, we'll call the queen our great mother. That's how she'll be related to us. And you'll be, because she'll be our mother, we'll be related to each other as brothers and sisters. That's the relationship that was envisioned at the time of treaty. And it didn't end up in that way. So we have this whole idea of the European idea of sovereignty. And it has to do with a superior human being who has been appointed by God. God appointed Queen Victoria to be leader not only of England, but also the Church of England. Queen Elizabeth is the head of the Church of England, and she got that way because God appointed her. That's what it is with this idea of sovereignty. Now, there was a period at the very beginning of the relationship in the 1600s where indigenous nations were regarded as nations, and even in European terms were regarded as being sovereign. And so at one point there were these 4 Mohawk kings, they were called. The Mohawk people do not call their leaders kings. They call them Lodiane. Lodiane means the nice people, the good people. But these 4 Mohawk kings are invited over to Europe, and while they're over there, they're wined and dined as if they were kings, and people came from other countries to see them over there. Early in the settling of Great Turtle Island by Europeans, indigenous sovereignty, if I can use that word, were understood, was recognized and accepted. In fact, European nations courted Indians, come and work with us because we're fighting this other group of Europeans over your land. And so this was the map at the time. We've got one area of land that is the Canadian, another part is claimed by the French, another part is down in the bottom right, is called the 13 colonies. They're breaking away from England. They want their own country. Indians come and be on our side because we're going to fight the other side. Over in the brown thing on the left at the bottom are the Spanish. There's a French flag flying over York Factory. The European nations are fighting, and what are they fighting over? Indian land. And so the time came in the year 1701 in eastern Canada when there were 1,300 delegates. Can you imagine 1,300 delegates arriving in Montreal of First Nation people? And they entered into a treaty called the Great Peace. And following that treaty, there was 100 years of war that had been ended. And this was a very important time in Canadian history, and a Canadian stamp was issued in honor of that, of the great treaty that was entered into between France as a sovereign nation and the indigenous sovereign nations. And following that, there were additional peace treaties in 1725 all over eastern Canada. And the settlers used this as a time to expand their control of Indian lands. They used the peace for that purpose. And so things got to be that in 1753, the Mohawk Nation said, "We're breaking our chain of friendship with you." There used to be a thing called the chain of friendship. And it was said that the British boat was going to be tied with the strongest rope they could find to the biggest oak tree they could find, so that if ever a storm came up and that ship were blown out into the sea, that chain of friendship would hold them there. It was an alliance. It was a very strong alliance with the English at the time. But the Mohawks announced in 1753, "We're tired of this. We're going to break off. We're done. You guys don't know how to behave yourself." And so at that time, the American settlers began to occupy the Confederacy lands. And in 1754, there was an elaborate ceremony in which the settlers brought a silver chain to show its value, a silver chain to restore the friendship, and friendship was therefore restored. Sovereignty was expressed in European terms. And then there was the outbreak of the 7 Years' War in 1756 between the British and the French. And the Iroquois Confederacy was neutral in that conflict. And then came Pontiac's War, which we mentioned yesterday. Chief Pontiac had just led a rebellion that had burnt down 10 of the 12 British forts, and they were going to drive the English into the sea. The English needed peace badly. And so they offered the Royal Proclamation of 1763, confessing to the great abuses which have been perpetuated. Believe us, these were abuses that took place. We're so sorry. Runners were sent out all over eastern North America. And the next year, 1764, 2,000 chiefs representing 24 nations as far as the Mississippi, as Hudson Bay. I'll bet you your ancestors were at the Treaty of Niagara. And Niagara was the joining of 24 nations. And a wampum belt was done, and that is the wampum belt, called the 24 Nation Belt. And it was the peace, and it was accompanied by the 2-row wampum. And this is what they said to the Englishmen at the time. "Englishmen, although you have conquered the French, you have not yet conquered us. We are not your slaves. These lakes, these woods and mountains were left to us by our ancestors. They are our inheritance, and we will part with them to none. Your nation supposes that we, like the white people, cannot live without bread and pork and beef. But you ought to know that the Great Spirit and Master of life has provided food for us in these spacious lakes and on those woody mountains." You know, those were the words that were spoken. Words of a people who believed that they were masters of their own future. They had their own laws, they had their own lands, and they had the support of the Creator. And so the first colonization of Canada did not take place in the 1700s, did not take place in the early 1800s. Colonization of Canada began with Confederation in 1867. When you celebrate the 150th anniversary of Confederation, you're celebrating the colonization, the beginning of colonization in Canada. And it did not take them a decade after confederating that they passed their first act for the gradual civilization of the Indians. So the point of all of this stuff that I'm telling you is that all of the ingredients to decolonize are already elements of settler history. In other words, the history that is the settler's history has to be decolonized. And so whose history are we going to choose from? Well, there may be some of you who say, I'm tired of being an Indian, I want to be a Canadian. I'm going to give up this stuff, I'm going to move to Vancouver, I'm going to do something else. But let's carry on with this first Indian Act. It was not a decade until a permit was required to leave the reserve. And 3 or more Indians were not allowed to gather together without a permit. 3 guys could not stand on a road corner or crossing and talk about how are things, because they'd be arrested and put in jail by the Indian agent who was also a justice of the peace. Indian agents were justices of the peace, and they sentenced Indians to jail. Indigenous governments were to be destroyed. The tribal system was to be done away with. Children were to be removed from their homes. The vanishing red man, the Indians are going to disappear anyhow. And so that St. Catherine's Milling case that I mentioned was decided by the top court in Canada without a single Indigenous person present. The takeover of the sovereign government, of your governments, was in full swing. And so in 1923, a Cayuga chief, part of the Iroquois Confederacy, took the case over to the League of Nations, which was like the United Nations in those days. And Discahe went over there and said, I represent the Cayuga Nation, a part of the Six Nation Confederacy. I want to speak to the other nations of the world about what's happening at home. He was blocked by one country, first Britain, then Holland. Canada is not present because Canada is still not a country. But Discahe is trying to take his message. And in 1924, while Discahe is over speaking about what's happening in Canada, the Canadian government invaded the council house of the Iroquois Confederacy at Six Nations on the Six Nation Reserve. And they took everything, and they planted their own system of government under the Indian Act. And all those things that they took, all the different symbols and the wampum belts and everything, are held today in Canada's National Museum of History. They're still there. So, at Akwesasne in 1920s, there was a case there because there were a number of white settlers right in the middle of the reserve. And they said, we have a 999-year lease. We signed a release with your grandparents. 999 years. People laughed. Said, out of here. They went into court. And the Supreme Court ruled that a 999-year lease is a sale. It's not a lease. And therefore, it is illegal. The next year, Parliament passed a law saying, it is legal. It's now legal. We just passed a law making it legal. That's what happened. And so we try to go back in the court again to have another legal action. And they passed another law, the law that was mentioned earlier. An Indian cannot hire a lawyer to prosecute a claim, and a lawyer cannot take a claim to the courts. At that time, an Indian could not be a witness in a court trial. If some white guy beat up an Indian guy and they go to court, the Indian guy cannot be a witness in the case. Why? Because he's too primitive to know the meaning of an oath to tell the truth. That's the law of Canada at that time. And as I say, it was the law of Canada until 1952. And this was the world I was born into. We're not talking about ancient history. Well, maybe I am ancient, but we're talking about a long time ago. And for over a century, this settlement disease began to take its toll. And this paradigm of the doctrine of discovery gets in there. So, these are the two narratives. You've got your narrative of who you are, where you came from, how you got here, what your rights are, where your land is. You've got this narrative ingrained in your mind. But settlers have something else ingrained in their mind. And their mind is Canada is a moral and benevolent place. It would not mistreat other people. It invites people from all over the world. How is it possible they could discriminate against Indians? And this is this national dream of innocence. And the settler defines progress, this progress, as very positive and takes credit. Look at the progress we have made in Canada over the years. And that's why you can't breathe the air and drink the water. The innocent bystander, the fact the current generation doesn't believe it's responsible. And there's this obsession that you may have noticed in different places in Canada where there are these monuments. The first white child was born here. The first white women crossed this river at a certain time. And there's a quotation from an author. He says, it's as if the country did not precede the traveler. In other words, the country only came to be there when it was occupied by a white settler. This narrative of the Indian is what conceals poverty, trauma, injustice, the ongoing exclusion. When members of Parliament hear about this, senators of Canada hear about it, they are absolutely shocked. They can't believe it. And when they go on visits to reserves, and I suggest you invite your members of Parliament to visit your reserve, to come into your housing, to see the health situation. They will not believe what they are seeing, and they will be devastated. So, I wanted to add one thing to it. I wanted to mention to you why you are not Aboriginal people. It would really be nice if all of you would take an oath. I will never refer to myself as being an Aboriginal person. Why? Because Aboriginals are those creatures over there in British Columbia that were the beasts of the forest. See, in that term, those are Aboriginal people. But when the treaty commissioner came to meet with you, you had to give your consent. And without your consent, they could not enter into the treaty. There's a difference between that and the Aboriginal. What does the word Aboriginal mean? It means before before the originals. Who are the original people of Canada? The English and the French. The Aboriginal people are the people that were here before the original people. I know it doesn't make sense, but that's the way it is. You see? You are people who had the right to give your consent or not give your consent to the treaty. And that's what makes you different. Now, the thing that becomes very hard to understand is we've had the Chilcotin case, just recently, 2014, in which the Chilcotins were given Aboriginal title to their land, which means that the Aboriginal title is on top of the Crown title, but they do have a huge area of 1,475 square kilometers and all the oil and the forests and everything on it because they have Aboriginal title. So you figure it out. There's two brothers and they live on either side of the Rocky Mountains. And one day they're talking and the one brother that lives on the other side says, hey, we got a treaty coming our way. Are you going to join us with the treaty? The guy on the Pacific side of the mountain says, I don't think so. I'm going to stay with the tribe. I'm not going to do a treaty. Okay. So they meet a little while later, years later. The old men, they meet. Say, how did that thing go? What happened to you? Oh, he says, we got 1,475 square kilometers of the land. We've got all the oil and everything on it, the mines, everything else. We run it like our own. You know, we're really happy with what we got out of treaty. How would you get, bro? I got 160 acres. So why would anyone enter into a treaty? You see? Because the Aboriginal people got all this land. Something's wrong here. You know, I mean, it's just obviously very, very wrong. And you all have to start saying, this is wrong, what is happening. It's not just that we have a right. It is you are committing a wrong against us to insist this is your land and not ours. We are not asking you for your land. We're asking you for our land. And if you want to know why, read the treaty. Read the treaty. So you are consent people. You have the power of consent. And that is why you are not Aboriginal people. And this brings up another subject, and it has to do with this famous thing called consultation. Because if we're going to put in a nickel mine or something else up in Treaty 5 territory, we're supposed to consult with you. Here's the plans. This is what we're going to do. And is that okay? You got to say, yeah. Oh, well, we have this concern and that concern and so on and so forth and so on. But then they build the mine, right? But if you have consent, they don't build the mine. So the next time people come over from the province of Manitoba or the government of Canada and say, we have a development that we're proposing that may impact act upon your rights. And we'd like to consult with you about it so that we can accommodate your rights as best we can. And then we're going to build the mine. See? You say, no, I'm sorry, we are not Aboriginal people. We do not hold Aboriginal title. We hold treaty-confirmed title. And we have the right to give consent or not give consent. Sit down and let's talk. See, that's the kind of change in attitude and thinking and your understanding of who you are needs to be. So I've taken up a lot of your time. It must be getting close to the lunch hour. So I'll quit. I'm going to be here the rest of the day. I'll be here all day tomorrow. If you want to talk, I'd be happy to talk with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rory. It's great as usual.